Number 16. LaMore Whitehead. Bishop LaMore Whitehead is an eccentric pastor from Brooklyn who has been making news headlines for years with his over-the-top behavior. He preaches based on the prosperity gospel, which associates the accumulation of wealth with spiritual well-being and a healthy relationship with God. Whitehead was known among locals for years before he began appearing in national news. He is perhaps best known for his conspicuous displays of wealth, including designer suits and luxury vehicles. As you can imagine, it wasn't overly surprising when federal agents arrested him in May of 2023 for suspected fraud, extortion, and other financial crimes. According to federal prosecutors, Whitehead solicited money from the victim through threats and false promises of enrichment. In one instance, he allegedly told someone he could use his political connections to make a multi-million-dollar business deal go through. Whitehead is accused of pocketing the funds and failing to deliver on any of his promises. According to court documents, Whitehead tried to con a businessman into giving him $500,000 and to let him in on some real estate transactions. He promised that he would use his connections with the city to obtain favorable treatment that would yield millions of dollars in profits for them both. In reality, he has no connections with the city and allegedly knew that he was incapable of delivering on the promise. Whitehead also allegedly used threats of force to obtain $5,000 from one of the businesses owned by the man he tried getting $500,000 from. Authorities have also accused him of conning a 56-year-old woman out of $90,000. According to federal prosecutors, he promised to help the woman buy a house. She withdrew the money from her retirement account and handed it over. When she got a bad feeling about the situation and asked for the money back, Whitehead reportedly told her that it was too late to back out and that the money had already been invested. He also allegedly lied to the FBI during the investigation and told them that he only had one phone when he actually owned two. Agents discovered the second phone's existence when they were scouring Whitehead's phone records and saw that he regularly texted a number saved under the name My Other Phone. Whitehead faces 1 count each of wire fraud, attempted extortion, and false statements. His lawyer, Dawn Florio, told the press that he adamantly denies any wrongdoing and said that he plans to vigorously fight the charges. His arrest came less than a year after masked thieves interrupted one of his services and stole all his jewelry. They also stole his wife's bling during the robbery, which was captured on camera and was being live-streamed online. The suspects were arrested and charged accordingly. In recent years, New York City Mayor Eric Adams has come under scrutiny for his alleged friendship with Whitehead. After Whitehead's recent arrest, Adams said that he expects everyone to follow the law and declined to comment further. Number 15. Shannon Kuszi. While working as a youth pastor at the Crossing Church of the Nazarene in Houston, Texas in 2019, 29-year-old Shannon Kuszi faced alarming accusations of abuse stemming from an incident that had allegedly happened 4 years earlier. The details of the case were largely withheld from the public, but authorities revealed that they believed she had an inappropriate relationship with a young man she mentored as part of her job as a pastor. A grand jury indicted Kuszi on an indecency charge, and she was booked into the Fort Bend County Jail on $25,000 bond. She bonded out under conditions that required her to surrender her passport and to stay at least 500 feet away from the victim's home. The case received little press coverage, but court records show that Kuszi was ultimately acquitted. Officials declined to provide the media or the public with an explanation for what led to the allegations being dropped. Number 14. Sha Goof. In 1993, Joy Risker entered Pastor Sha Goof's church in San Diego as a wayward teen in search of guidance and became entranced by his charismatic personality. She joined his youth group and they began an intimate relationship 3 years later. At the time, Goof was married to a woman named Sheila. After having their first child, he began pressuring Sheila to enter a polygamous relationship. She was against the idea, but eventually gave in out of a fear that she would lose her marriage and custody of their child if she continued to refuse. Joy's mother also disapproved of polygamy, but she ultimately gave her blessing to avoid losing her daughter. In 1997, Goof married Joy Risker at a polygamous church in Utah. She moved in with Goof, Sheila, and their son, and gave birth to 2 children over the next few years. Polygamy is illegal in California, and it's also socially shunned. And by that point, Sean had become a popular televangelist preacher for a large church that was deeply against polygamy. He and Joy kept their marriage a secret for several years before word somehow got out about his lifestyle. After being fired from his church, he formed his own group of Christian polygamists and began holding meetings regularly. In the meantime, Joy held a job outside the home while Sheila took care of their children. From the outside looking in, they looked like the polygamists' version of a perfect family. But as they say, looks can be deceiving. Over time, Sean became increasingly possessive over his second wife. He read Joy's email and controlled the finances and began lashing out in jealous fits of rage. When a male friend hugged Joy during her 21st birthday celebration at a club, Goff punched him in the face. During a party at a friend's house in 2003, Goff accused Joy of flirting with another man and lost his temper in front of everyone. A friend tried to calm him down, but he said he wanted to leave. He pulled Joy out of the house and could be heard yelling at her in the street, saying that she would never see her children again if she refused to get in the car with him. Goff later confided to friends that he was getting fed up with Joy's attitude. He described her as lazy and sloppy and talked about wanting to get rid of her. During a conversation with a co-worker, he said that he planned to give Joy a few weeks to shape up or ship out. In the meantime, Joy told her friends that she was planning on leaving Goff as soon as she had enough money to support herself without his help. She planned to take her 2 children with her and would have never even thought about leaving without them. During the early morning hours of September 19th, Goff's first wife left with the family's 3 children for a weekend trip. When she was driving home 2 days later, Sean called her and said that he had taken Joy to the hospital because she had gotten upset and cut herself when he threatened to sue for full custody of their kids. He asked Sheila to clean up the blood at the house, and she did as she was told. Sean returned home the next day covered in scratches. His clothes were torn and a rental SUV he had been driving was filled with mud and gas cans. Joy never came home, and Goff told people that she had left him and skipped town. Her friends and family didn't believe him, especially since she would have never left her kids behind. As more and more people began to ask questions, Goff gave different stories about where his wife had gone and who she was with. Suspicious that Joy's safety was in jeopardy, her friends emailed her and told her they wanted to meet up and talk. She replied saying she didn't want to meet and claimed she was traveling around. Unconvinced that they were communicating with Joy, the friends continued pressuring for answers. In response, they received an email telling them to mind their own business, which seemed extremely out of character. They got the police involved, and investigators were quick to question Goff, who claimed that Joy had run off with another man. He eventually realized that law enforcement and Kayla's loved ones were not going to stop looking for her until they found answers. The stress of maintaining a cover story became too much to handle, so he showed up at a police station and confessed to murdering Joy. He refused to disclose the location of her body, which was found by hikers in the Arizona desert a few months later. During his trial, Goff argued that he fatally stabbed Joy in self-defense. But there was overwhelming evidence that he had orchestrated her murder, and the jury convicted him of the crime in 2006. He was sentenced to 26 years in prison. Number 13. Stuart Allan Klock. In February 2021, a pastor from Malden, Missouri named Stuart Allan Klock went viral for delivering a degrading sermon that objectified women and blamed them for the poor behavior of men in relationships. An internet user who was watching the service online felt horrified by Klock's behavior and shared the footage on social media. In the video, Klock discussed how women should stay thin for their husbands, even if they can't be a trophy wife like Melania Trump. More specifically, he said that wives should pay enough attention to their looks for a participation trophy and to avoid looking like a butch, peppering his disturbingly sexist rant with comments like, "Thank God for makeup." Klock also preached that God made men to be attracted to good-looking women, but that most women don't seem to understand this because they don't try hard enough to be attractive. The speech only became more cringeworthy as it went on, devolving into commentary about how wedding cake seems to diminish a woman's desire for intimacy and how women should wear perfume and makeup so they don't look ugly and stink. Klock went on to imply that it's acceptable for a man to cheat on his wife if she fails to meet his needs in the bedroom. He also said that the best way for women to become sufficiently attractive is to control their weight, and that they should put down the cupcakes and instead put on makeup. The First Baptist Church apologized for the sermon and said that Klock's views don't align with the church's values. The pastor took a leave of absence and went to counseling. Less than 2 months later, he issued a statement announcing his plans to return to the pulpit. Klock apologized for his unbiblical remarks and acknowledged that he had nobody to blame for his behavior except himself. Number 12. Pastor Rodney Howard Brown. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic in early 2020, government bans against large gatherings were met with fierce resistance throughout the United States. Many people blatantly ignored orders to limit their socializing and to practice social distancing to curb the virus's spread. In Tampa, Florida, a controversial megachurch pastor named Rodney Howard Brown kept his church open in defiance of a stay-at-home order limiting gatherings to no more than 10 people. During his sermons, he openly mocked the public's growing fears over the virus's spread, describing the illness as a phantom plague and claiming that it was part of a bigger plan to shut down houses of worship and exterminate people by injecting them with a deadly vaccine. Howard Brown also encouraged his parishioners to continue shaking hands during church meetings because, in his words, they were revivalists, not pansies. In late March, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office visited Howard Brown's congregation and warned that his church meetings violated the stay-at-home order. The gatherings continued, so Sheriff Chad Chronister issued an arrest warrant against the pastor for unlawful assembly and violating public health emergency orders. In a statement, the sheriff said he had no choice but to take legal action after Howard Brown's ongoing refusal to follow the rules. The pastor was arrested the next day and quickly posted the $500 bond to get out of jail. At that point, he scaled back on his war against the stay-at-home order and announced that he would keep his church closed for the time being. Howard Brown insisted that he wasn't shuttering the church out of respect for COVID policy, but to protect his congregants from government tyranny. He denied the sheriff's allegation that he had repeatedly ignored warnings to start following the rules and described his arrest as unnecessary. The pastor further claimed that his church was following social distancing guidelines and taking other safety precautions, and he denied that there were any political overtones to his strongly worded sermons. Authorities dropped the charges 2 weeks later. Howard Brown was no stranger to controversy before the pandemic. In 2017, he referred to Hurricane Irma as a nothing burger, despite the storm killing at least 50 people and causing widespread power outages to millions of homes. A few weeks later, he claimed that elite Hollywood celebrities routinely drink blood, practice cannibalism, and ritually sacrifice children. He's also known to dabble in alt-right conspiracy theories and other ideologies that encourage people to be extremely paranoid about the government trying to control their every move and thought. It would likely take all day to mention every inflammatory and eccentric statement that has come out of Howard Brown's mouth, so I'm going to assume that you get the idea and move on to the next item on today's list. Number 11. Julius Shak Now. Julius Shak Now grew up in a Jewish household in Brooklyn, New York during the 1920s and 30s. After serving in World War II, he converted to Christianity and began studying the Bible. During the 1960s, he began preaching near his home in central Connecticut under the name Brother Julius. Shak Now was not a particularly remarkable or attractive man. He was short, had a scraggly beard, and carried an overall frumpy appearance. But he had an uncanny ability to draw people in with his words and charisma, and he quickly began to build a following. In addition to his public speaking talent, Shak Now had good timing. He began spreading his message at a time when young people were increasingly rejecting mainstream religion and seeking spiritual guidance outside traditional church settings. During the late 1960s, Shak Now established a group called The Work. In 1970, he began claiming that he was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. His followers believed him, and the group continued to grow. They eagerly indulged in their new leader's sermons, which contained an unusual mix of Christianity, Judaism, and science fiction. Members began turning their paychecks over to Shak Now, giving him and his wife Joanne complete control over their finances. They received a small allowance while the rest of their money went straight into Shak Now's pocket, funding a lavish lifestyle while the congregants themselves lived in abject poverty. Shak Now imposed strict rules on his followers that he didn't follow himself. Women were banned from wearing makeup and were required to dress conservatively, while their leader led a promiscuous and wanton lifestyle. At some point, he began sleeping with group members' wives, which he referred to as special work. He also used his knowledge of scripture to con young women into bed, convincing them that it was God's will for them to be intimate. Over time, Shak Now became increasingly controlling and abusive. He allegedly began hitting entire families with belts during his sermons, while everyone else watched, and started claiming that he was God. It sounds crazy from the outside looking in, but by then his followers were brainwashed. Most of them continued to believe what they were told, and those who dared to leave were told that terrible things would happen to them. Shak Now continued to rule over his cult with an iron fist, until his death from a heart attack in 1996 at the age of 71. His chief apostle, Paul Sweetman, took over until he was imprisoned for bank fraud in 1999. Sweetman disappeared shortly after his release in 2004. His leg bone was found on a golf course a month later, but it wasn't identified until years later. Former members Rudy Hannon and Sorek Minnery were charged with Sweetman's murder in 2018. Hannon died from COVID in 2020 while awaiting trial, and Minnery took a plea deal in exchange for a reduced prison sentence. He claimed that he and Hannon killed and dismembered Sweetman at the urging of his wife, Joanne, and distributed the body parts throughout the state. Joanne died in 2011 before any charges were brought in the case. The cult reportedly still exists today and has somewhere between 75 and 100 members. Number 10. Jamal Klock. During the early morning hours one day in 2017, police were called to an apartment complex in Washington, D.C., where they found Jamal Klock's unit engulfed in flames. Klock, who was the pastor of a church in Baltimore, wasn't home when officers arrived. He told law enforcement he was in Georgia at the time, although cell phone data placed him just a mile from the scene within 5 minutes of the alarm being pulled. The fire caused over $40,000 in damages and left at least one neighboring unit uninhabitable. Investigators soon discovered that Klock applied for a fire insurance policy just 8 days before the blaze broke out. In an $11,000 claim he filed after the fire, he wrote that he wasn't responsible for causing it and said that he lost items that he had actually removed from his apartment before the fire. Based on the evidence at the scene, experts concluded that Klock had doused his mattress in gasoline and deliberately torched the apartment. In a statement, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia said that numerous residents were evacuated from the 94-unit complex during the fire, including elderly people and young children. Klock was arrested on a slew of charges and ultimately pleaded guilty to arson, felony destruction of property, and insurance fraud. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and, as I'm sure you could probably guess, is no longer a pastor. Number 9. Mark Lewis. Just days before Christmas in 2013, Sarah Nottingham went to the church in Vacaville, California, where her boyfriend Mark Lewis served as a pastor, and told him that she no longer wanted to be with him. She was unhappy with his behavior and suspected that he was involved in criminal activity, and she wanted no part of any of it. During the meeting, Lewis allegedly warned her that she had created a monster by breaking up with him. In a filing document for a restraining order against Lewis, Nottingham wrote that she had been trying to end the relationship for weeks. She also claimed that when she refused to see Lewis on Christmas Eve, he threatened to ruin her holiday. The next day, Nottingham found her car windshield shattered. A few weeks later, someone threw a Molotov cocktail through her living room window, causing a fire to break out. Police were quick to pull over a U-Haul truck not far from the scene with 3 homeless locals inside. The suspects, who were identified as 30-year-old Kristen Broyles, 28-year-old Richard Wright, and 33-year-old Anthony Newbolt, reportedly admitted that Lewis had persuaded them to firebomb Nottingham's property. All 4 suspects were charged in connection with the case. During a search of Lewis's home, investigators found methamphetamine, a gun, and other evidence connected to the crime. According to court documents, at least 3 informants told law enforcement that in the 2 years leading up to the firebombing incident, Lewis was distributing methamphetamine and involved with burglaries. Nottingham told reporters that Lewis abused his position as a pastor by gaining vulnerable people's trust and then manipulating them into doing his dirty work. He allegedly provided down-and-out individuals with food, shelter, clothing, and other things before asking them to damage the property of people who upset and commit other crimes. Lewis initially rejected a plea deal that would have sentenced him to 10 years in prison. He ultimately pleaded no contest to stalking and arson and received an 8-year prison sentence. The other 3 suspects received sentences ranging from 16 months to 11 years. This may not be the end of Lewis's legal troubles. During the highly publicized case, law enforcement launched a separate investigation into the suspicious death of his ex-wife, who was found dead in 2011 from what initially appeared to be a suicide. Number 8. Carlton Thunderberg. In a disturbing display of entitlement that was captured on camera in 2022, the founder of a megachurch in Missouri berated his congregation for not buying him a luxury watch. In the clip, Carlton Thunderberg called his followers poor, broke, busted, and disgusted for not forking bigger donations to the church at the Well in Kansas City. During the scathing sermon, he asked, "I'm not worth your McDonald's money. I'm not worth your Red Lobster money." Thunderberg went on to ask worshippers if he was worth the designer labels they spend money on. He complained that he had asked them to buy him a Movado watch from Sam's Club the year before, but never got one. In case you're wondering, Movado watches typically go for anywhere between $300 and $3,000. Thunderberg continued talking down to his churchgoers, calling them his cheap sons and daughters. He justified his insulting rant by saying that he was just trying to get everyone to understand what God is saying. Footage of the disturbing diatribe went viral on TikTok, and the online community was quick to voice its disapproval of Thunderberg's behavior. Many commentators accused him of being a greedy, false prophet who took advantage of his followers. One social media user asked which of the Gospels mentions a Movado watch, conveying the sheer obnoxiousness of Thunderberg's tantrum. The disgraced pastor posted an apology video to the church's YouTube channel. He claimed that there was context behind the content of the clip, but he acknowledged that he had hurt people with his words and insisted that the video did not reflect what was in his heart. Thunderberg specifically addressed those who had never heard of him until they saw the viral clip, stating that he regretted giving such a negative first impression of himself. He said that he had apologized to the congregation privately and that they remained loving and supportive toward him. He also apologized to preachers and pastors who were personally affected by the controversy. While Thunderberg may have done enough damage control to stop his congregation from turning against him, many people were unmoved by the apology. Number 7. Linda Green. In 1991, a group of traveling New Age practitioners called the Samaritan Foundation bought an abandoned jail in Guthrie, Oklahoma, and began living in it. They were led by a woman named Linda Green and had followed her around the country as she held seminars to promote her beliefs and gain new followers. Green's philosophy was based largely on a practice called dowsing, which involved using a pendulum and a chart to make decisions. She encouraged her followers to dowse when it came to everything from serious illnesses to choosing their outfits for the day. After buying the old jail, Linda strongly encouraged her followers from around the country to move in. Many people were quick to drop everything and abandon their families and careers. The building was dilapidated and falling apart, but the group tried to make it livable by installing showers and converting the jail cells into sleeping areas. They spent most of their days studying under Linda's guidance, which became increasingly dark and controlling over time. She claimed that evil forces were threatening humanity and told her followers that they had to dedicate their lives to her teachings in order to stop the apocalypse from happening. According to Linda, they could save the world through intensive dowsing, which sometimes went on for days with no breaks. Group members eventually started becoming delirious from the lack of sleep and fresh air. Local police became concerned that the group was a cult and tried to investigate, but Linda refused to cooperate. Meanwhile, she became increasingly paranoid that authorities were threatening her control over her followers. She forbade everyone from using the phone or leaving the compound, effectively cutting them off from any contact with the outside world. Linda eventually became so paranoid that she disbanded the group and relocated to Wyoming with 3 members, including her ex-husband Dennis Green and her current husband Allan Ross. Linda had divorced Green for Ross when the group was living in the abandoned jail. Green felt emasculated and hurt, but was so brainwashed that he remained loyal to Linda. Allan Ross had met Linda through her teachings and had only ever known her in the capacity of a spiritual leader. Seeing her outside of a cult setting at the house in Wyoming opened his eyes to the fact that she was a mere mortal. Ross began to realize that Linda was abusive and started reclaiming his freedom. In 1995, he took a job on a film project out of state. Linda was so angry at him for doing something without her permission that she tracked him down and showed up at the job site. In what would turn out to be a fatal mistake, Ross left the job and returned to Wyoming. When friends and family stopped hearing from Ross entirely, they began to worry that he had encountered foul play. They had always thought Linda's lifestyle and beliefs were strange and suspected that Ross had gotten sucked into a cult, but they knew that Ross would never voluntarily cut them out of his life. The family spent 5 years urging law enforcement to search the Wyoming home for Ross's body. Finally, in 2000, his remains were found partially buried in a crawl space in the basement. He had been shot twice and castrated. Linda was no longer living at the house and had relocated to Arkansas. She died in 2001 from alcohol-related liver failure and was never charged in the case. Former Samaritan Julia Williams eventually admitted that she had helped move Ross's body. She claimed that Linda's ex, Dennis Green, had shot Ross, but many believed that she was just trying to prevent Linda from being implicated in the crime, even in death. Williams was convicted of being an accessory after the fact and served 2 years in prison. Dennis Green denied shooting Ross and claimed that Linda had committed the murder. To this day, nobody knows exactly what happened or who was responsible for it, but it was clear that Ross had paid for his decision to leave the cult, and Linda with his life. Number 6. Mariam Mbula. Founded in 2008, the London-based Salvation Proclaimers Anointed Church, also known as SPAC Nation, attracted a large following of young worshippers, mostly under the age of 30, and portrayed itself as a charity that helped former gang members and criminals turn their lives around. The church was praised by the press as recently as 2018, but things took a dramatic turn the following year when law enforcement began investigating dozens of allegations of fraud and other possible crimes. Former members accused the congregation's leaders of pressuring them to take out large loans and to give the money to the church. The funds were allegedly used to support the lavish spending habits of high-ranking members, including senior pastor Mariam Mbula, who won the public over with stories about her journey as a reformed criminal. In 2020, she was outed as a career fraudster who's done time in the UK, Belgium, and Italy. By then, she had at least 13 convictions under her belt. In the BBC documentary Catch Her If You Can, multiple women described how Mbula allegedly swindled them out of anywhere from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars. The victims were frustrated at law enforcement's apparent lack of action against Mbula, and they banded together to expose her crimes and warn the public. They claimed that Mbula offered to help them in various ways as a way to gain access to their money. In one case, she reportedly offered to use her connections to buy discounted airfare for a woman who wanted to visit her dying grandmother in Jamaica. The woman wired Mbula the money to make the purchase, but never received the plane tickets. Another victim was evicted from her home after being bilked out of thousands of dollars and going so broke that she searched beneath her furniture for spare change to buy food with. In response to the allegations against some of its leaders, SPAC Nation said that it wasn't responsible for what happened in members' homes or elsewhere outside the church. Amid the controversy, the ministry was deemed insolvent and rebranded itself as various new churches and organizations. According to the most recent updates, both the organization and Mbula were under investigation, but criminal charges have not been brought against any suspects. Number 5. Travis Clark. During a nighttime walk in September 2020, a passerby noticed that the lights were on at the St. Peter and Paul Catholic Church in St. Tammany Parish, Louisiana. Out of curiosity, they peered in through a window and were shocked by what they saw. The church's priest, Travis Clark, was getting freaky on the church's altar with 2 dominatrixes. The women were dressed in corsets and high-heeled boots, not exactly their Sunday best, and Klock was half naked. They were surrounded by an array of items that didn't belong in any part of a church and appeared to be filming the encounter using a cell phone on a tripod and portable stage lighting. The horrified onlooker captured footage of the encounter and turned it over to law enforcement. Because the unholy hookup occurred within public view, police went to the scene and arrested Klock and the two dominatrixes for obscenity. During questioning, 23-year-old Melissa Chang and 41-year-old adult film actress Mindy Dixon said that they were filming role play with Klock. The day before the incident, Dixon reportedly wrote in a social media post that she and another dominatrix were traveling to the New Orleans area to defile the house of God. Both women pleaded guilty to reduced misdemeanor charges and received 2 years of probation each. Klock was kicked out of the priesthood shortly after his arrest. He pleaded guilty to felony obscenity and received a 3-year suspended prison sentence, along with 3 years of probation. In addition to being fined $1,000, he was ordered to pay $8,000 in restitution to the church, perhaps to replace the altar that was ritually burned and destroyed. Number 4. Kevin Wallen. In a shocking example of how quickly someone's life can spiral out of control due to drugs, Kevin Wallen went from being a highly respected Catholic priest in Bridgeport, Connecticut, to earning himself the nickname Monsignor Meth over a 2-year period starting in 2011. When parishioners began to notice subtle changes in his appearance and behavior that grew more obvious with time, he lost a considerable amount of weight in a short time, began acting strange, and became increasingly absent from his priestly duties. Rumors soon began to swirl about Wallen doing very unpriestly things in his spare time. He cross-dressed, bought an adult novelty store, and engaged in steamy trysts with various men. Within months of the noticeable shift in his behavior, the Archdiocese placed him on leave and then suspended him for failing to address personal and health issues. Wallen's double life was further exposed in early 2013 when the 61-year-old was arrested for dealing crystal meth. Federal prosecutors accused Wallen of leading a methamphetamine distribution ring and laundering his ill-gotten proceeds through the adult shop. If convicted of all the charges he originally faced, he could have faced a lifetime in prison. He pleaded guilty to a methamphetamine conspiracy charge and received a shockingly lenient sentence of just 5 years and 5 months. With credit for time served after his arrest, it amounted to 3 more years behind bars. In hindsight, Wallen's fall from grace was less sudden than it had seemed. Subtle signs of his growing disillusionment with the Catholic faith began to appear years earlier, when the stress of running a church that was on the verge of financial ruin began to wear away at him. By the time Wallen was arrested, fellow clergy members were well aware of his active dating life, despite his vow of celibacy. But they didn't know that he was trafficking drugs and were at least somewhat oblivious to the full scope of his other life. Even after the truth came out, Wallen received dozens of letters of support, urging the court for leniency. After his release, he seemed to have a hard time staying on the straight and narrow. In 2018, Wallen was sent back to prison for 9 months for failing a drug test and violating his parole. It's unclear what he's up to or how he's doing now. Number 3. Michael Todd. In 2022, footage of American megachurch pastor Michael Todd covering a parishioner's face with his saliva during a sermon went viral. The gag-inducing clip showed the preacher spitting into his hand while on stage at the Transformation Church in Tulsa and talking about how Jesus restored a blind man's sight with his saliva. Audience members could be heard gasping and groaning in shock and disgust as Todd rubbed his hands together and smeared his spit all over the face of a parishioner who was standing beside the pastor with his eyes closed. In addition to being gross to begin with, the sickening display came amid a spike in COVID-19 infections throughout Oklahoma. Within days, the video had garnered millions of views on social media. The internet rescinded with widespread disapproval of Todd's bizarre behavior, and he was quick to apologize in a Twitter post. He admitted that the act was disgusting and explained that his passion for giving people hope sometimes caused him to go to extremes. Todd was aware that he had taken his excitement too far and that the spit demonstration took away from the message he was trying to convey. The man who received the strange spit bath was identified as Todd's brother, who declined to comment on the incident. Todd reassured his followers that he had checked on his brother to make sure he was doing okay amid all the unexpected publicity. Number 2. Kirtanananda Swami. Steve Bryant grew up moving from place to place as a military brat and struggled to find his place in the world after barely graduating high school. His soul-searching mission came to an end in 1974 when he crossed paths with a recruiter from the Hare Krishnas, a Hinduism-inspired religious group that became famous on the streets of America's cities for their chanting and robes. Bryant was sold on their promises of enlightenment and abandoned his wayward lifestyle to become a full-fledged member of the group. He moved into the Krishna temple, where he shaved his head, traded his blue jeans for a robe, and became a vegetarian. 3 years later, he met and married his wife Jane, and they moved onto a sprawling 500-acre Krishna commune in rural West Virginia called New Vrindaban. Led by a man named Kirtanananda Swami Bhaktapada, or Guru K for short, the community had a questionable reputation among the Krishnas for being extreme in its practices. Steve was appalled by the dismal living conditions at New Vrindaban, where he and Jane slept on a basement floor with no indoor bathroom. While devotees lived in filth and had nothing, Guru K and his highest-ranking disciples stayed in the group's opulent temple and wanted for nothing. When Steve discovered that the leader and his entourage were beating people as a punishment for breaking the rules, he began challenging the leadership at New Vrindaban and ultimately decided to leave. Jane refused to go with him and remained at the compound. Now living out of his van, Steve vowed to expose the truth about Guru K. For 2 years, he traveled to Krishna communes across the country, interviewing members who had also experienced abuse and corruption at New Vrindaban. They implicated Guru K in fundraising scams, forced prostitution, physical abuse, and other horrifying crimes. Steve also found a letter written by the late founder of the Krishna movement, Swami Prabhupada, describing Guru K as a crazy person and a false prophet. In 1986, Steve decided he had done all he could to make law enforcement and Krishna leaders aware of what was going on at New Vrindaban, and that it was time to let go and start a new life. But that never happened, because one of Guru K's top enforcers tracked him down in Los Angeles and shot him at point-blank range when he was sitting in his van. The shooter, Thomas Drescher, was convicted of murder and sentenced to life. Federal investigators found damning evidence that Guru K paid Drescher to carry out the hit. His fingerprints were on the money that was paid to Drescher for the murder, and it appeared as though there were also plans in the works for another paid hit on a Krishna member that Guru K was warring with. Kirtanananda Swami and his enforcers were eventually ousted from New Vrindaban, and he served 8 years in federal prison for mail fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and other charges. After his release in 2004, he moved to India, where he died in 2011 at the age of 74. Since then, the Krishna governing body has implemented new measures and increased oversight for preventing corruption and abuse within its ranks. Number 1. Joseph Mcloon. During an audit in 2018, the Archdiocese of Philadelphia discovered that one of its priests, 55-year-old Joseph Mcloon, had opened a bank account in his parish's name 7 years earlier. He never told anyone about it, and the account wasn't on the parish's books, which violated Archdiocese policy. The Financial Council froze the account and launched an investigation, which found over $110,000 in deposits that were never recorded in the church's records. While some of the things that the money was spent on were consistent with typical parish expenses, other findings were concerning. Monsignor Mcloon admitted to using some of the funds for inappropriate personal expenses, including travel and a beach house. He had also sent payments to men he met on the Grindr dating app and had relationships with, which was in clear violation of his vow of celibacy. He resigned from the church and was charged with felony theft and other crimes. Mcloon pleaded guilty to 2 counts of mismanaging money. He was sentenced to 5 years of probation, which included 9 months of house arrest. He was also ordered to perform 300 hours of community service, write apologies to the church and archdiocese, and pay more than $30,000 in restitution. Additionally, the disgraced pastor was ordered to provide a DNA sample, undergo a mental evaluation, and get any treatment that the results indicated he needed.
Eli Weaver and Barbara Rabel. Murders are extremely rare, if not unheard of in Amish communities. which is why people were shocked when a well-liked mother of 5 named Barbara Weaver was murdered at her home in Apple Creek, Ohio in 2009. One of Barbara's children had found her unresponsive in bed and alerted a neighbor who went to the community's phone booth and called the police. Someone had fatally shot the 30-year-old in the chest. Detectives found cash in several parts of the home, ruling out robbery as a motive. At the time, Barbara's husband Eli was on a fishing trip. Law enforcement tracked him down through one of his non-Amish friends, who had a cell phone, and they brought him in for questioning. Eli insisted that he had no involvement in his wife's murder, but he remained a suspect. Barbara's sister told police that Eli had a history of cheating with women outside the Amish community. He had moved out twice due to his affairs and was shunned from the local church, but had earned forgiveness from the church elders upon his return. As a devout member of her faith, Barbara didn't see divorce as an option, so she chose to forgive her husband. According to her sister, Barbara had become suspicious that Eli was cheating on her again in the months leading up to the murder. Eli swore that his cheating days were over, but in the days following the murder, people saw him spending a lot of time with a married Mennonite woman named Barbara Rabel. Mennonites live a strict old-fashioned lifestyle, but are allowed to have modern conveniences like cars, phones, and electricity. Rabel often worked as a hired driver for the Amish, so her presence in the community was normal. But her interactions with Eli seemed to suggest that their relationship was deeper than business. During questioning, Rabel admitted to having an affair with Eli, but insisted it had ended months earlier. Another mistress, Dandy Heasley, said she met Eli on a dating website, leading to investigators to discover that he had a secret cell phone. In his dating profile, he described himself as an Amish stud and posted shirtless photos of himself. And apparently, his profile appealed to a lot of women, many of whom came forward to report that Eli had frequently talked about being miserable in his marriage and wanting to have his wife killed. Heasley helped police get the number to Eli's secret phone by reaching out to him online and telling him to call her. Phone records revealed that Rabel was paying for the phone, and she and Eli were still entangled in an affair. Eli had convinced his mistress that their relationship could only continue if Barbara died, and they talked at length about the best ways to kill her. In the end, they were each charged with murder. Eli took a plea deal and admitted to complicity to commit murder in exchange for a 15-year prison sentence. He'll be eligible for parole in 2024 at the age of 44. Rabel turned down a plea deal and went to trial despite having admitted to the crime during questioning and was found guilty of aggravated murder. She was sentenced to life in prison and will become eligible for parole in 2032. 7. Hayley Littlefield and Logan Runyan. When 46-year-old Francis Kelly from Indiana failed to pick up his daughter on his birthday in January 2021, the girl's mother, Courtney, became concerned. She called the police, who knocked on Kelly's door and left after receiving no response. Courtney then went to the house herself and found him dead on his couch. An autopsy concluded that Kelly was strangled to death. He also had blunt force trauma injuries and fentanyl in his system. Investigators searched the phone of Hayley Littlefield, another ex-girlfriend of Kelly's, who he was entangled in a child custody dispute with at the time of his murder. They were to go to court just days after he was killed to sort out a complaint Kelly had made about Littlefield refusing to let him pick their child up and insisting on staying at his house during visits. In a text conversation from 3 days before his body was found, Kelly accused Littlefield of tampering with his oatmeal when she was at his house the night before. He said he took a few bites and that the food tasted funny, and that shortly afterward he started to feel lightheaded. But Littlefield acted like she didn't know what Kelly was talking about. Just days into the investigation, Littlefield's ex-husband revealed that her 22-year-old daughter, Logan Runyan, had told him that her mum had paid her boyfriend, Robert Walker, $2,500 to hire a hitman to kill Kelly. A relative of Littlefield told police that she had made several bizarre statements after the murder, including that Kelly was better off dead and that she might as well say she killed him because she was crazy and pregnant. It was soon revealed that Runan had accompanied her mother to Kelly's house the night before he ate the suspicious-tasting oatmeal. Another one of Littlefield's exes said she'd told him that Runan put fentanyl in Kelly's oatmeal. After receiving the accusatory text from the victim, Littlefield and Runan allegedly climbed into his home through a window and found him dying on the floor. The ex-boyfriend also claimed that Littlefield had asked him repeatedly in recent months about how much fentanyl it would take for someone to fatally overdose. Runan testified against Littlefield as part of a plea deal and was sentenced to 26 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. She told the court that she and Littlefield poisoned Kelly's food on 3 separate occasions. Littlefield was found guilty of murder and several other charges, and received consecutive sentences totaling 115 years behind bars. Runyan's boyfriend, Robert Walker, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and was sentenced to 10 years in prison for his involvement in Kelly's death. 6. David Love and Theresa Stone. 42-year-old Randy Stone was shot to death in cold blood at his insurance office in Independence, Missouri in 2011. As a devout Baptist churchgoer and married father of 2, he was a pillar of the community, so locals struggled to understand who might want to kill him. Randy and his wife Theresa had what seemed like a storybook marriage. It was clear to everyone who knew the pair that Randy was head over heels in love with his wife of nearly 20 years, and Theresa seemed to feel the same way about her husband. The couple's lives were centered around their faith, and they spent a lot of their free time at their church. Randy taught Sunday school, drove church buses, and acted as a financial advisor, and Theresa participated in church activities and sang in the choir. He was also best friends with the pastor of his church, David Love, who he looked to as a spiritual mentor. Love presided over Randy's funeral with a deeply moving and seemingly heartfelt eulogy. Meanwhile, investigators began to dig for clues in hopes of identifying the killer. A shell casing at the scene matched the type of Glock handgun Randy owned, which happened to be missing from his house. In Theresa's office garbage, they found a torn-up card or letter. Put together, the pieces revealed a handwritten message wishing her a happy birthday and stating, "I'm not in control of things yet, but when we're fully together, your birthday will always be exciting." Oddly enough, the handwriting didn't match up with Randy's. Theresa eagerly provided receipts and other evidence to confirm her alibi, but in the eyes of the investigators, she seemed a little too prepared to clear her name. But she was caught totally off guard when detectives asked her about the ripped note, and she didn't have an immediate answer. Investigators left her alone in the interrogation room for a few minutes, during which time she was captured on camera saying to herself, "Oh great, I forgot about that." She claimed the letter was from a secret admirer, but police didn't buy the story. Adding to their suspicion was the fact that Theresa had visited Randy's friend and colleague Robert Davis less than 24 hours after the murder to ask how long she had to wait for the $800,000 life insurance payout she was expecting. Detectives were especially intrigued by rumors of an affair between Theresa and Pastor Love, who was married with 3 children. They learned that Theresa had gotten pregnant and miscarried after Randy had a vasectomy. She eventually admitted that she and Love had been secretly seeing each other for 10 years and blamed him for Randy's murder, claiming she had no knowledge of or involvement in the crime. David Love pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a life sentence, with the possibility of parole starting in 2036. His wife has since divorced him and remarried. Theresa pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and was sentenced to 8 years in prison as a result. 5. Stephen and Katie Plad. After struggling to raise a baby they weren't ready for, who was born in 1998, Stephen Plad and his wife, Alyssa, put their daughter up for adoption. The girl, named Katie, tracked down her biological parents in Henrico, Virginia in 2016. They reunited, and she eventually moved in with them and her siblings. But something seemed off to Alyssa about the relationship between her husband and Katie. The couple was having marital problems, and Stephen often slept on the floor of Katie's bedroom. Shortly thereafter, Stephen and Alyssa ended things and moved into separate residences. One day, Stephen handed Alyssa the diary of one of their children and said that the kid had been misbehaving. But when Alyssa read the journal, she found an entry stating that Katie was pregnant and that Steve was the father. He'd even encouraged his other kids to call Katie their stepmom. When Alyssa confronted Stephen, he allegedly admitted that he'd gotten Katie pregnant and said they wanted to marry each other. Authorities in Virginia soon caught wind of the incestuous relationship and launched an investigation. When they caught up with Stephen and Katie in 2017, the couple had a baby with them. One of Katie's Instagram posts revealed that she and Stephen had gotten married in a simple wedding. However, they'd lied and said they were unrelated. The two were charged with incest, adultery, and contributing to delinquency, and were extradited to Virginia. Shortly after the arrest, Alyssa told the press that she blamed Stephen for the unnatural affair. She even accused him of brainwashing and seducing their oldest daughter, and said that she believes Stephen gave her the diary because he was too much of a coward to tell her about the relationship and pregnancy directly. Stephen and Katie bonded out of jail, but were banned from going near each other by the judge overseeing the case. Custody of the child was awarded to Stephen's mother, and Katie moved back in with her adoptive family in New York State. Unable to cope with the changes brought on by the arrests, Stephen tracked Katie down and shot her dead in a blind rage. He also lost his own life as a consequence of his unchecked emotions, bringing a tragic end to a twisted love story that never should have happened in the first place. 4. Pamela Smart and William Billy Flynn. After graduating from Florida State University in 1989, 22-year-old Pamela Smart took a job as a media coordinator at a high school in New Hampshire. She'd married her husband, an insurance agent named Gregory, just months earlier. However, there were already problems in the relationship. Gregory had supposedly confessed to Pamela that he had a one-night stand, leaving her self-esteem shattered. Ironically, she was running a program at the school where she worked called Project Self-Esteem, which is where she met a student volunteer named William Billy Flynn. Pamela and the younger student then began a steamy affair that ultimately led to tragedy. One afternoon in 1990, Pam came home to find her husband dead on the floor in a pool of blood. He'd been shot in what initially appeared to be a home invasion gone wrong. During the investigation, the father of one of Billy's friends, Vance J.R. Latimer Jr., turned a .38 caliber pistol into the police, saying that he suspected it might be the murder weapon. Latimer, Billy, and another suspect, Patrick Pete Randall, eventually admitted to their roles in the murder. Billy claimed that Pamela threatened to end their affair unless he killed Gregory. He admitted to shooting the victim in the head, while Randall held Gregory at knife point. Latimer drove the getaway car, and a fourth suspect, Raymond Fowler, was also said to be in the vehicle at the time. They all pointed at Pamela as the mastermind of the crime. Pamela's friend, Cecilia Pierce, wore a wire and captured recordings of her making incriminating statements and seemingly encouraging Pierce to lie to investigators. 3 months after Gregory was killed, Pamela was charged with first-degree murder for organizing the hit, even though she didn't pull the trigger and wasn't there when it happened. She claimed that she had tried to end her affair with Billy numerous times, but that he threatened to hurt himself if she broke up with him. Pamela also claimed that she didn't know about the plot to kill Gregory. The prosecution, on the other hand, depicted Pamela as a manipulative older woman who used her feminine wiles to persuade her teen boyfriend to murder her husband. Billy, Latimer, Randall, and Fowler cooperated against Pamela in exchange for lighter punishments. Billy and Randall pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and were paroled in 2015, just days after the 25th anniversary of the crime. Latimer was convicted of being an accomplice to second-degree murder, and Fowler was found guilty of conspiracy and attempted burglary. In 2005, they were both paroled. Pamela was convicted of first-degree murder and is currently serving a mandatory life sentence without parole. She continues to maintain her innocence and was denied parole for failing to take responsibility for her actions. Her request for a commutation hearing was denied, and the Supreme Court upheld the decision. she's since exhausted all her options for a legal appeal. 3. Robert and Michael Beaver. During the late night hours of July 22, 2015, 911 dispatchers in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma received a call from a young person who said that his brother was attacking their family. Officers arrived at the residence to find the front porch saturated in blood. Inside, they discovered a teenage girl clinging to life with multiple stab wounds and the survivor who'd been left unharmed. The 911 caller and 2 of his siblings had been stabbed to death along with their parents, 52-year-old David Beaver and his 44-year-old wife, April. One of the survivors identified their brothers, Robert and Michael Beaver, as the killers. Shortly thereafter, police apprehended the 2 suspects in the woods behind their house. An investigation revealed that the brothers had planned the massacre well in advance and in great detail. And as a consequence, they were each charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. Neighbors told the media that the Beaver family mostly kept to themselves. The kids were homeschooled, and they interacted so little with the community that many people had never even heard of them when news of the murders broke. Robert reportedly told authorities that he wanted to be remembered as a notorious serial killer. He said that he and Michael had planned to continue their murder spree until they'd killed at least 50 victims. The brothers craved attention and recognition, and they hoped to outdo some of recent history's most infamous mass killers, including the Columbine shooters and James Egan Holmes, who opened fire on a packed movie theater in Colorado during a Batman premiere in 2012. In the end, both defendants were convicted of murder. The judge overseeing the case sentenced Robert to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Michael was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 38 years. His earliest opportunity for freedom will come in 2056, when he'll be 57 years old. 2. Weldon McDavid and Diana Lovejoy. 47-year-old computer programmer Greg Mulvihill was an ordinary family man who was known for being mild-mannered and calm. He was an unlikely candidate for trouble, but he managed to find it one night in 2016 when he was shot in the chest on a remote trail in Carlsbad, California. At the time of the shooting, Mulvihill was with his friend Jason Kovac, who was shot in the armpit and dialed 911. Miraculously, they both survived the ordeal. Kovac told prosecutors that Mulvihill had received a mysterious phone call earlier that night from someone claiming to be a private investigator. The caller said that they had important information about Mulvihill's soon-to-be ex-wife Diana Lovejoy. When the men arrived at the designated meeting spot, they saw a man laying on his stomach in camouflage. When they realized he had a gun, they tried to run as he fired multiple shots in their direction. At first, Mulvihill and Lovejoy's relationship had seemed picture perfect. They met on a dating website in 2005 and clicked over their love for the outdoors. 2 years later, they were married. The couple bought a home, and in 2012, Lovejoy gave birth to a son. Things took a disappointing turn in 2014 when Mulvihill lost his job, leaving Lovejoy with the responsibility of being the household's sole breadwinner. Around that same time, Lovejoy began to suffer from chronic fatigue. She suspected that she had a chronic pain condition called fibromyalgia, and that her and Mulvihill's son suffered from kidney problems. To others, it seemed like she was being irrational, especially since she refused to have the boy looked at by a specialist. Lovejoy also accused Mulvihill of abusing her, which many people found hard to believe given his non-confrontational demeanor. The couple's problems strained their relationship past the point of saving, and eventually they separated. Their court battle became contentious as they struggled to reach an agreeable divorce settlement and to peacefully co-parent their son. They were in the finalizing stage of their divorce when Mulvihill was shot and had recently been granted 50-50 custody. The shooter was long gone by the time police arrived at the scene, and there were no shell casings left behind. However, officers found a towel soiled with fresh human feces, so they took it into evidence and sent it in for DNA testing. During the investigation, detectives learned that Lovejoy had been having an affair with her married shooting instructor, Weldon McDavid. She had started taking lessons from the former Marine sniper around the same time she began claiming that Mulvihill had brutally assaulted her, which law enforcement never found any evidence of. McDavid apparently believed the allegations though, and was furious about the recent custody ruling. The feces that had been tested turned out to be a DNA match for McDavid, leading authorities to suspect that he and Lovejoy had co-conspired to murder Mulvihill. They also found evidence that Lovejoy had paid McDavid $2,000 to carry out the hit. Lovejoy maintained her innocence throughout her trial. McDavid claimed that he was such a skilled shooter that he would have killed Mulvihill if he'd wanted to. Both defendants were convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and attempted murder. The judge sentenced Lovejoy to 26 years to life, while McDavid received a sentence of 50 years to life. 1. Paula and Melissa Millard. During an evening out at a pub in the London suburb of Cheam on New Year's Eve in 2016, 22-year-old Paula Millard and her 49-year-old mother Melissa got into a brawl with a woman in her 40s. The victim was rushed to the hospital shortly before midnight after receiving multiple serious injuries to her face and wrist. 3 months later, authorities charged the Millards with causing grievous bodily harm in connection with the incident, which has been described as a brutal assault. In the end, the mother-daughter duo were each slapped with a 5-year prison sentence.
Dorothy Puente. During the 1970s and 80s, a sweet-looking grandmotherly woman named Dorothy Puente welcomed the down and out into her boarding house in Sacramento, California. Many of her boarders lived on the margins of society, without any close family ties or a strong support system. Puente was praised among social workers for taking in adults who had nowhere else to go, including the elderly, disabled, alcoholics, drug addicts, and mentally ill tenants. Nobody would have ever guessed by looking at her that she had a lengthy criminal history, had abandoned her own children, and was taking advantage of her current clients. Her first boarding house was shut down when she got caught stealing her boarders' Social Security benefits. She took a job as a personal caretaker and was caught drugging clients and stealing their valuables. A court psychiatrist described Puente as a schizophrenic with no remorse, who should be closely monitored. She served a 3-year prison stint and opened a boarding house. When her probation officer stopped by, she claimed that the people at her house were visiting friends or family members, and it failed to trigger any red flags. This wasn't the only sign that something was terribly wrong at Puente's house. One boarder died from a drug overdose in 1982, and authorities were quick to rule out foul play after Puente told them that the woman suffered from depression. 3 years later, in 1985, Puente hired a handyman named Ismael Flores to build a large box. She said she was going to put some belongings in it and asked Flores to help her bring it to a storage facility. During the drive, however, she had him pull over and asked him to help her push the box into a river. A fisherman discovered a corpse inside. It was so decomposed that it would take 3 years for authorities to identify it as one of Puente's tenants. The elderly landlady continued to fly under the radar until 1988, when a boarder named Alvaro Montoya vanished. He was 59 years old and had been chronically homeless for years when he moved into Puente's boarding house. A counselor Montoya had worked with noticed his absence and raised the alarm. Police visited Puente, who claimed Montoya was on vacation. A tenant backed up her story, but discreetly informed the officers that Puente was making him lie for her. After finding nothing during a search of the house, authorities obtained a warrant to dig up Puente's backyard. They dug up 7 bodies. Meanwhile, Puente went on the run. She was picked up in Los Angeles 5 days later and charged with 9 counts of murder. During her trial, the court heard about how she poisoned and strangled her victims, then continued to receive their Social Security benefits. the jury convicted her of 3 of the murders. It's commonly believed that she was also responsible for the other 6, but the jury decided that the evidence didn't meet the burden of proof. Puente was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Puente died behind bars in 2011 at the age of 82. 10. Virginia B. Davis. By the time 51-year-old John Wimbrough died in 1997, he was mostly a bedridden alcoholic. But his declining health isn't what ended his life. Someone beat him to death at the Eastern Virginia home he shared with Virginia B. Davis, an 87-year-old great-grandmother who was well known in her rural town for being impressively active for her age. An autopsy revealed that Wimbrough had been bludgeoned in the head at least 4 times, which caused his brain to swell and his heart to stop. He had 2 black eyes, 9 or more broken ribs, and dozens of bruises. It wasn't until a year after his death that authorities charged Davis with murder. And while it was hard to believe that a woman who scarcely weighed 100 pounds, 45.4 kilograms, could kill a much larger and younger man, prosecutors alleged that it was certainly possible considering Wimbrough's deteriorating health. Wimbrough and Davis lived together for about 20 years leading up to the crime. On the day of Wimbrough's death, Davis had called family members and told them that he was seriously ill from alcohol withdrawal. Authorities suspected Davis's son-in-law, J. Grady Britt, was somehow involved in the killing, but was never able to prove it. There was also speculation that someone had purposely rearranged the liquor bottles in Wimbrough's room to bring attention to the fact that he was a heavy drinker, and perhaps in an attempt to mislead law enforcement. Davis initially maintained her innocence in court, arguing that Wimbrough's injuries were caused by recent falls. She eventually took a plea deal and admitted to voluntary manslaughter in exchange for a 10-year suspended prison sentence, making her the oldest Virginian on record to be convicted of the charge. The judge sentenced her to 90 days of house arrest with an electronic ankle monitor and ordered her to pay an undisclosed amount of money in court costs. While the law applies equally to everyone, or is at least supposed to, it seemed like the prosecution was okay with sparing Davis from prison time. As part of the plea deal, she acknowledged that there was likely enough evidence to convict her, but did not admit to murder. Commonwealth attorney Richard C. Grizzard told the Washington Post that the justice system had served its purpose of answering the question of whether Davis had killed Wimbrough, adding that there was no place for a woman her age in the state's prison system. Her attorney, Richard G. Bridges, made it clear that his client still maintained her innocence. She would have risked a trial that could have ended with a mandatory 20-year sentence. As Bridges pointed out, even a 5-year prison sentence would have most likely meant that Davis would spend the rest of her life in prison. The circumstances surrounding the altercation that led to Wimbrough's death remain unclear to this day. 9. Patricia Ebel. A bikini-clad grandma named Patricia Ebel was driving her BMW around in Naples, Florida with her grandson in the car in 2015 when she rear-ended a Ford Mustang. As Collier County Sheriff's deputies administered a sobriety test to the barely clothed woman, she reeked of booze, according to an arrest report, and she allegedly bombed the sobriety taste. Authorities accused Ebel of having a blood alcohol content more than twice the legal limit and charged her with driving under the influence. She was sentenced to probation and banned from drinking alcohol for a year. But she was busted for drinking while she was still on probation when her blood alcohol level tested at more than twice the legal limit. In 2017, after sorting out her legal issues, Ebel opened up to Inside Edition about her scandalous run-ins with the law. She said that several people offered to buy the bikini she was wearing when she got her DUI, but that she held on to the two-piece. Patricia also admitted that she still drives around in a bikini, but that she wears a cover-up now, which perhaps isn't as crazy as it sounds, considering she lives in Florida. 8. Eva Bratcher. When 38-year-old Sabrina Watson got a bad feeling about the well-being of her grandmother, Regina Michalski, in early 2023, she called the Chicago police and requested a welfare check. For years, she had been unable to reach Michalski. Her own mother, 69-year-old Eva Bratcher, lived with Michalski, but had blocked Watson's phone number. Watson also couldn't find any obituaries for Michalski, who was in her 90s, and nobody answered the door whenever she tried visiting. She had long been wary of her mother, who she believed would do anything for money. Back in 2010, Bratcher had been sentenced to 4 years in prison for stealing Watson's identity and applying for government benefits under her name. It was just one of multiple forgery crimes that had landed Bratcher in and out of prison over the years. Watson told ABC 7 Chicago that before her mother went to prison, she instructed her to bury Michalski under someone else's name if she passed away before Bratcher's release. When Watson asked why, Bratcher allegedly called her an idiot and said that she wouldn't be able to continue collecting Michalski's checks if her death was on record. While Bratcher was locked up, Watson campaigned against her mother's release and warned people on social media to steer clear of her. So when some time went by without being able to reach her grandmother, she had a gut feeling that something was wrong. It eventually began to take a toll on her health, which was when she requested the welfare check. During a search of the residence that Michalski and Bratcher shared, police discovered Michalski's body in a freezer in the garage. They also found a receipt showing that the fridge was purchased 2 years earlier, an ID with Michalski's name and Bratcher's photo on it, and a notation on a calendar suggesting that Michalski had died 2 years earlier. Neighbors told law enforcement that they hadn't seen Michalski in years. Bratcher told some of the people in her multi-unit building that her mother was in a home in Wisconsin, and she spoke about Michalski as if she were still alive. Authorities charged Bratcher with concealing her mother's death and for having a fake ID. According to the most recent updates, the case was still under investigation. Investigators have speculated that Bratcher may have kept her mother's death hidden in order to continue collecting her Social Security checks and other benefits. Watson told ABC 7 that she believes without question that her mother's motive was financial. Bratcher was held on $20,000 bond, and the case is ongoing. 7. Celestia Barker III. Police in Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania, received an unusual call one day in 2022 when a woman identifying herself as 74-year-old Celestia Barker III asked them to drop felony charges against her grandson. She allegedly told the person she spoke with on the phone that her grandson was caught with a pipe and a small amount of marijuana, and asked him if he had it in his heart to make the case go away. The officer said no, at which point Barker reportedly told him that she practiced witch activity and that he would be in jeopardy. When the officer told her that making threats against law enforcement is a crime, she said she was just making statements. The cop hung up, but Barker repeatedly called back. According to court documents, which claimed that during one conversation, she said she practiced white witchery and warned the police to look over their shoulder. State police contacted her about the multiple phone calls and the threats she was accused of making, and she responded by stating that she was just giving the police an ultimatum, the way that they had given one to her grandson. Needless to say, this is not the approach to take when it comes to helping out a loved one who's in legal trouble. Barker was charged with 1 felony count of threatening unlawful harm to influence the judicial process, and misdemeanor counts of misusing 911, harassment, and disorderly conduct. 6. Joyce Cohen. Joyce Cohen was perfectly capable of working, but in 1994, she applied for Social Security disability benefits for depression and addiction-related health issues. She was approved, and she went on to collect her monthly check for 23 years before the federal government discovered that she was working full-time as a nurse under the stolen identity of her husband's first wife. To make matters even more bizarre, the feds found no record of Cohen's husband ever having divorced wife number 1. they also uncovered an application Cohen had submitted in 1991 requesting to change her name to the name of the first wife, as well as an application to change the first wife's legal birth date to Cohen's birth date. In addition to bilking Social Security for decades, Cohen received housing subsidies and other benefits, amounting to a total of $300,000 in stolen funds. She was 60 years old when authorities came to arrest her at her Brooklyn home in 2017. After allegedly trying to escape out a window, she was taken into custody on charges of Social Security, passport, and housing voucher fraud. During her arraignment, Cohen's public defender described her as deeply vulnerable and prone to panic attacks after suffering for years in an abusive relationship. Darrow noted that his client had divorced her husband under Jewish law the year before her arrest, and he pointed toward her alleged trauma as the reason she might freak out in response to federal agents showing up at her door. Cohen pleaded guilty to stealing $160,000 from Social Security and was ordered to repay it, along with $117,000 to the New York City Housing Authority. 5. Vera Bunyak. After receiving a report of a home burglary in progress and a description and license plate number of the suspect's car one day in 2015, police in Rockaway Township, New Jersey, pulled the vehicle over. They were surprised to see 78-year-old Vera Bunyak behind the wheel with her 18-year-old grandson, Timothy, and his friend, 24-year-old Melanie Coviello, in the passenger seats. Inside the car, officers found $4,000 worth of stolen electrical equipment, including a Nintendo Wii, video games, and other items. They also found heroin and a hypodermic needle. According to authorities, Coviello had access to a real estate's lockbox at the house, which enabled her to get the key to the home. Police Lieutenant Peter Riley offered few details about the situation when questioned by the New York Daily News. He said he didn't know if Bunyak was aware that she drove the getaway car in a robbery, but that he wasn't going to say anything else because he didn't want to jeopardize the case. Bunyak was charged with possession of stolen property and released on her own recognizance. Melanie Coviello and Timothy Bunyak were charged with burglary, theft, possession of stolen property, and Timothy was hit with an additional drug charge for the heroin and needle. 4. Candace Kelly. Over a 4-year period, starting in 2009, a woman in her 60s named Candace Kelly sold 100 pounds, 45.4 kilograms of marijuana out of her Buffalo Township, Pennsylvania home. During a raid of her mobile home in 2013, police seized 64 pounds, 29 kilograms of hydroponically grown pot, 2 pounds, 0.9 kilograms of hashish, 2 pounds of psychedelic mushrooms, and $400,000 in cash. Law enforcement also found drug pipes and other paraphernalia, including a grinder and a scale, as well as items that were used to package marijuana and other drugs. In court, Kelly claimed that she used the proceeds from her drug business to support her 4 grandkids, whom she was raising at the time. She bought marijuana for $3,300 per pound, 0.45 kilograms, and sold it at a profit of $100 per pound. Kelly pleaded guilty to drug sales, possession, and conspiracy. She was ordered to forfeit $393,000 and was sentenced to 15 to 30 months in prison. Her lawyer had urged the judge to spare her from any time behind bars, but the amount of time she received wasn't overly harsh, considering the fact that she was facing up to 10 years behind bars. 3. Ursula Haverbeck. Nicknamed the Nazi Grandma, Ursula Haverbeck was sentenced to 10 months in a German prison in 2015 for denying that the Holocaust occurred. At the time, she was in her 80s. In the year leading up to her sentence, she had accused Germany's Central Council of Jews of persecuting innocent people. The report was deemed unfounded and prompted an investigation against Haverbeck for filing a false complaint. After being released from prison, Haverbeck continued to voice her disturbing beliefs. and racked up several more Holocaust denial charges. She unsuccessfully appealed them all and was sentenced to 2 years in prison in 2018, but failed to turn herself in to begin her time. So authorities tracked her down at her home and took her into custody. Haverbeck was released in 2020 and was soon hit with yet another charge for being a Holocaust denier. While handing down a 1-year sentence, the judge overseeing the case told the 93-year-old that she isn't a Holocaust researcher like she seems to think, but that she's a denier who spreads poison rather than knowledge. And while nobody feels particularly good about putting an elderly person in jail, the judge said that Haverbeck's behavior left him with no other choice. She began her sentence in 2022, and it's probably safe to say she'll continue landing herself in prison for the rest of her life. 2. Hester Burkhalter and Lena Bartula. The cannabis compound CBD has become popular in recent years for the therapeutic benefits it provides without the mind-altering effects of marijuana. But its over-the-counter availability in some states and its illegal status in others has led to some complicated and confusing legal cases. For example, in 2018, a 71-year-old grandmother named Lena Bartula was arrested at the Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport in Texas, having a vial of CBD oil that she used for treating back pain. She was hit with a felony drug charge, spent the night in jail, and missed her flight. In 2019, 69-year-old Hester Burkhalter was arrested at Disney World for having a vial of CBD oil in her purse. She relied on it to relieve arthritis pain and even had a doctor's note permitting her to use it. But she was nevertheless charged with a felony. The women both saw their charges reduced or dropped, but Burkhalter still felt wronged after her case was settled. She sued Disney, the Orlando Police Department, and the Orange County Sheriff's Office, claiming that the deputies who arrested her were hell-bent on putting her in jail. The lawsuit accused the defendants of assault and battery, false arrest and imprisonment, defamation, and emotional distress. Burkhalter claimed that she panicked and began vomiting while being taken into custody, and that law enforcement denied her proper medical care. And she described being arrested in front of her relatives and being strip-searched at the police station as humiliating. The senior citizen is asking for more than $18 million in damages for herself and her family members who were vacationing with her at the time of her arrest. According to court records, the status of the case is pending. 1. Rosie Pate. 68-year-old Rosie Pate was baffled when a reporter from Memphis-based news station WREG showed up at her house in 2014. The reporter asked her about an arrest affidavit that had been filed against her over an incident that had occurred the night before. The complaint accused Pate of dialing 911 and asking the police for assistance in getting a beer. She adamantly denied the allegation. Pate said that she had asked her granddaughter, Kioshia, to go buy her a beer the previous evening, and that they got into an argument when the young woman refused. She said that she told the police the disagreement between her and Kioshia was about beer, but that she wouldn't dare call the police and ask them to deliver the boozy beverage. Unfortunately, what Pate described as a misunderstanding resulted in her facing a charge for misusing 911, as well as 1 count of domestic violence for the argument with Kioshia. The outcome of the case is unclear. Thanks for watching. Would you rather live next door to an elderly kleptomaniac who's constantly eyeballing your place and will take anything and everything that isn't locked up or nailed down? Or would you prefer to have an elderly neighbor who wants to have a 3-hour conversation every time you step outside? Let us know in the comments below, and remember to subscribe. See you soon. Bye.